The parish estate sits at the edge of Barrow Hollow, its blackened windows staring over a stretch of earth that refuses to bloom. Locals avoid it not just because of the silence, but because of what that silence hides. For nearly 2 centuries, the Parish family's name has been whispered only in warnings. Every generation, they say, brought forth twins. But after 1852, something went wrong. The births didn't stop, but the children stopped being entirely human. The year was 1852, and the Parish farmhouse stood in the heart of Barrow Hollow, surrounded by thick woods that never seemed to rest. The wind that night was heavy, pressing against the shutters like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of rain and something faintly metallic. Inside, candlelight flickered over the walls as Mary Parish clutched her swollen belly, her face slick with sweat and fear. The midwife, a woman named Eliza Moore, had delivered countless children in the county, but there was something about this birth that unsettled her. The Parish family was known for their twins. Every generation had them, as if cursed or chosen. But the whispers around town said the last few pairs had not survived long. No one ever saw their graves. The old grandfather clock struck midnight, its sound muffled by Mary's screams. Thomas Parish, her husband, paced by the doorway, his hands trembling as he whispered prayers he barely remembered. The air in the room grew colder with every contraction, and the flames of the candles leaned toward the open window, as if drawn by a presence unseen. When the first cry came, it was not the cry of a baby. It was sharp, low, almost like a gasp from deep underwater. Eliza froze, her eyes darting to the infant in her arms. The child's skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes opened before she could clean the blood from its face. They were too dark, too deep, like wells with no bottom. Before she could say a word, Mary screamed again, another life forcing its way into the world. The second twin came quickly, limp and silent. Eliza worked frantically, trying to draw breath into its tiny lungs, but the baby's body was cold to the touch, its fingers curled unnaturally tight. Thomas stepped closer, his face draining of color as he looked at what should have been his son's. The first twin was watching him, really watching, its gaze steady and unblinking, following his every movement. Eliza whispered a prayer under her breath, the same one her mother had taught her to keep spirits away, but the child tilted its head, almost amused, almost aware. When the thunder broke outside, the second twin let out a weak, short cry that died almost instantly. The wind blew out 2 of the candles. Eliza crossed herself and refused to touch the surviving baby again. "It's not right," she murmured, her voice shaking. "That thing's eyes. They ain't of this earth." Mary sobbed, clutching the dead twin to her chest, while Thomas backed away, his mind refusing to believe what he'd seen. Outside, the storm grew louder, but inside the Parish farmhouse, the true storm had only just begun to be dawn. The storm had passed, leaving Barrow Hollow washed in a strange, colorless light. The Parish house was quiet except for the soft wails of the surviving twin, muffled beneath layers of cloth. Mary sat motionless by the fire, her skin pale, her eyes hollow from grief and exhaustion. Thomas Parish stood at the door, his face hard and unreadable, his thoughts turning toward the church. In their world, every newborn had to be baptized within days, a tradition older than memory itself, but after what he had seen that night, the thought filled him with dread. Still, fear of gossip was stronger than fear of what he did not understand. He wrapped the baby in a wool blanket and walked the muddy path to St. Whitlock's chapel, a tiny wooden church that stood on a hill overlooking the hollow. Inside, Father Whitlock was preparing the altar when Thomas entered, clutching the child close. The priest, a stern man with trembling hands, had baptized every parish twin for 3 decades. He greeted Thomas with the usual blessing, but when Thomas pulled back the blanket, the words died on his tongue. The infant's eyes were open again, too large for its face, reflecting the flicker of the candles in a way that made the light bend and twist. Whitlock took a step back, the air in the chapel seeming to thicken. "What have you brought before the Lord?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Thomas stammered that it was his son, born healthy, born pure, that he only sought God's protection. But the priest shook his head slowly, fear creeping into his features. The child's breathing grew uneven, its chest rising and falling too fast. Whitlock made the sign of the cross, then froze. The sound that escaped the infant's mouth was not a cry but a low hum, deep and unnatural, like wind rushing through a hollow pipe. The candles nearest to them flickered out, and the chapel's air turned cold enough to fog their breath. The priest backed away, clutching his crucifix to his chest. "There are things that wear the face of man's seed but are not of his making," he said shakily. "This child bears no light of the Lord." Thomas pleaded with him, his voice breaking, but the priest refused, ordering him to leave at once and take the thing far from consecrated ground. When Thomas stepped outside, the sun had dimmed behind a cloud that hadn't been there moments before. The baby was silent now, staring up at him with eyes that reflected nothing. Behind him, the church bell began to toll on its own, echoing across the valley like a warning meant for anyone still listening. The night air was thick with rain and the smell of wet earth as Thomas Parish returned home, carrying the lifeless body of the second twin. Mary's wails filled the small kitchen, echoing against the wooden walls that had seen generations of births and deaths, but nothing like this. The child's skin was cold, almost blue, and its tiny mouth opened and closed as if gasping for something the world could no longer provide. Thomas laid the twin gently on a blanket, avoiding Mary's frantic hands, and felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. Every instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong, that this was no ordinary death, but the thought of neighbors and clergy seeing it stirred a different terror. They could never understand, and they could never know. By candlelight, Thomas dug a shallow grave behind the barn, the mud soaking his sleeves as he worked. The storm had left the soil loose and soft, but it resisted him in ways that felt unnatural, almost deliberate. The shovel struck roots and stones that should not have been there, and he swore the ground shifted beneath him, like it was aware of what he was doing. Mary knelt beside him, pressing her face to her hands, her sobs wetting the earth as if the soil itself drank her grief. When the tiny body was finally laid to rest, Thomas placed a small wooden marker above it, roughly carved with the twins' initials. Even in this moment of ritual, something in the barnyard felt off, silent yet heavy, watching. After the grave was covered, Thomas looked up to find the barn door creaking in the wind. He stepped back, heart hammering, imagining the child's spirit rising, returning to him in some horrifying form. Nothing appeared, and yet the hair on his arms remained stiff. His breath caught in his chest. Mary whispered prayers into the dark, words learned from her mother, from her grandmother, but they sounded hollow, powerless. Thomas wanted to speak, to comfort her, but his throat tightened. Even the animals in the barn seemed uneasy, the hens clustering at the far end, the horses shifting nervously, ears flicking toward the grave. Days passed, but the land refused to settle. Where the twin lay, nothing would grow. Not a blade of grass, not a sprout from the roots of the nearby apple tree, which had thrived for decades. The soil remained barren, as if rejecting life, a dark circle in the otherwise green yard. Villagers passing by noticed the patch, whispering of curses and restless spirits, and some avoided the farm entirely. Inside the house, Mary grew pale, sleepless, and Thomas felt a constant presence lingering at the edge of his vision. Shadows that moved too deliberately, the faintest echo of infant cries when the wind blew. The burial had not ended the terror. It had only begun, seeding something in the soil that would not rest, that would grow beneath the roots of the Parish legacy and wait for the day it could return. Elias Parish, the surviving twin, grew differently from any other child the villagers had ever known. While other children played freely in the fields or ran along the forest paths, Elias preferred the shadows, the quiet corners of the parish farmhouse, and the overgrown woods beyond the barn. His eyes, dark and unyielding, seemed to hold more than a child's understanding, reflecting moments of awareness that unsettled even his parents. Mary often caught him staring at the empty graves behind the barn or whispering to the wind, murmuring words she could not comprehend. Thomas tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was grief, the child's imagination shaped by tragedy, but even he could not deny the unease that crept along his spine whenever Elias was near. Neighbors noticed too. They claimed to see him at odd hours, standing silently at the edge of the woods, his gaze fixed on their homes as though he could see through walls. The children of the village avoided him instinctively, whispering rumors of a curse, and even the farmhands began to leave earlier, claiming the house didn't feel right. Inside the parish home, Elias roamed the halls with uncanny quiet, slipping between rooms like a shadow. Sometimes at night, the family would awaken to hear soft humming or faint laughter drifting from the attic or cellar. Sounds that no one could locate, yet they seemed unmistakably the child's. Mary tried to teach him to speak normally, to engage with the world, but the boy often refused, answering only in whispers or cryptic phrases that seemed older than his years. He would linger by mirrors, staring at his reflection for minutes at a time, tracing the curve of his eyes with trembling fingers, as if questioning what he saw. On rare occasions, Thomas glimpsed him conversing with someone unseen, nodding solemnly, his expression grave, and then vanishing down the hall before anyone else could follow. Sleep became impossible for Mary and Thomas. They woke to find furniture subtly shifted, doors left ajar, and the faint impression of tiny feet across freshly swept floors. Even within the safety of the farmhouse, there were warnings. The family cat, a normally fearless creature, would hiss at empty corners, bristling and arching its back, and the hens refused to enter the barn after sunset. Shadows seemed to cling to Elias, following him, merging with his presence. The boy's affinity for the dark became undeniable, and as he grew, the whispers outside intensified. Villagers swore they could hear his voice carried on the wind, calling their names softly at night, and some claimed to glimpse two figures, Elias and another they could not identify, slipping silently through fields and forests, vanishing before they could be reached. It was clear that Elias was not like other children, and as he approached his 10th year, the parish home itself seemed to acknowledge it. The walls groaned and creaked when he lingered in a room too long, the fire burned unevenly, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward him, protective yet alive. The surviving twins' existence became a constant tension between life and something else, a presence that was both part of the world and apart from it, leaving the parish family trapped in a fragile balance between fear, love, and an unspoken horror they could neither explain nor escape. A century passed, and the parish estate had long since been abandoned, its wooden beams rotting and windows blackened by soot and time. The villagers of Barrow Hollow had stopped speaking of the family aloud, though old whispers persisted, tales of children who were never entirely human, of graves that refused to rest, and of a house that exhaled shadows. By 1953, the estate had become little more than a crumbling relic, its walls sagging under the weight of years, the barns fallen in, and the orchards overrun with brambles and weeds. Yet one autumn night, a sound pierced the hollow stillness, carrying over the fog-laden fields. The faint but unmistakable cries of twins. The first villagers to hear it were farmers returning home from the distant hills. They froze in their wagons as the cries cut through the night air, echoing across empty fields that had not known a child's laughter in decades. The sound was both innocent and unnatural, high and sharp but threaded with something deeper, darker, that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Whispers spread quickly. Some insisted they had heard the voices before, a century ago, though how that could be true, they could not say. Those brave or foolish enough to approach the estate reported shadows moving behind the broken windows, flickering like candlelight when no candle burned. The doors remained shut, yet the crying continued, and it carried a weight that felt almost alive. Curiosity and dread drew some closer, including a few historians and local investigators who had spent their lives documenting the Hollow's haunted history. They found the house silent on entry, the floorboards coated in thick dust, the air stale and cold. The cries, however, persisted, originating from rooms that were empty and decayed, the nursery long since stripped bare of beds and toys. No logical explanation presented itself. Some theorized it was the wind through the broken chimneys, others that the echoes of the past had somehow become tangible, a ghostly replay of the Parish family's cursed lineage. Yet the sound was insistent, alive, almost pleading, tugging at the mind and gut alike, a presence that refused to be ignored. By the third night, entire families in the nearby village were leaving windows open, expecting the cries to carry through and reveal their secrets. Doors that had been locked for generations rattled with each gust of wind, and those who dared to walk near the estate reported glimpses of two small figures darting between broken trees and barns. The figures were barely more than silhouettes, indistinct in the fog, yet their movement was precise, purposeful, deliberate. Even those who had long dismissed the tales of the Parish twins found themselves trembling before the estate, sensing that something buried long ago had awakened, and that the cries they heard were a summons, a calling from a line that had never truly ended. The summer sun was harsh that year, casting long, unforgiving shadows across the Parish estate, but it did little to deter Harold Jennings, a local historian determined to uncover the truth behind the centuries-old legends. Armed with shovels, trowels, and a notebook filled with hand-drawn maps of the property, he arrived early one morning, the mist clinging stubbornly to the broken fences and overgrown paths. The townsfolk had warned him, as they always did, but curiosity outweighed caution. Every story, every whisper about the Parish twins, spoke of something buried beneath the barnyard, and Harold was determined to find it. The soil was soft from recent rains, and the air smelled of decay and damp leaves, heavy with an almost tangible expectation. As he dug near the barn, he struck the first obstacle. Roots thick and gnarled, interwoven with the earth as if guarding it. The shovel scraped against something harder than wood, and Harold's heart skipped a beat. He cleared the surrounding dirt carefully, revealing a small, twisted shape. It was a bone, thin and oddly curved, with a slight sheen despite the years. He paused, brushing away more soil, uncovering a second, then a third. They were tiny, impossibly small, and malformed in ways that made them difficult to classify. Not animal, not human, but a grotesque in-between. Wrapped around the bones was a decayed cloth, almost like a shroud, yellowed and brittle with age. Faint embroidery still clung to the edges, a design that mirrored the Parish family crest. Two intertwined serpents forming a double spiral, a mark that made Harold's stomach twist. He realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that these bones were not meant to be unearthed, that someone or something had intended for them to remain buried and forgotten. As he continued digging, a low hum seemed to rise from the soil, almost imperceptible, like the faint echo of a lullaby carried from long ago. Harold shook his head, blaming fatigue, but the hum persisted, and the shadows of the barn lengthened unnaturally as if leaning toward him. The historian documented every detail, careful not to disturb the arrangement too much. He noted the deformities, the elongated skulls, the small but strangely jointed limbs, and the fingers that curled in impossible angles. It was clear to him that these were the remains of children, yet children who had never been fully human. The realization was overwhelming. The Parish family's legacy of twins was not a simple genetic anomaly, not a strange coincidence. It was something far darker, something that had been intentionally altered, hidden, and preserved for generations. As Harold packed up his finds to examine them further, he glanced around the estate, the wind stirring the tattered curtains of the broken windows. A shiver ran down his spine. He had disturbed something sleeping, something that had waited patiently beneath the soil, and for the first time, he understood the stories were not mere superstition. The Parish twins had never truly left the world, and their secret, long buried, had just begun to surface. Among the scattered remnants of the Parish estate, Harold Jennings discovered a collection of yellow diaries hidden beneath the floorboards of the upstairs study. The bindings were brittle, the ink faded, yet the words leapt off the pages with a clarity that sent chills down his spine. The diaries belonged to the parish matriarch, Eleanor Parish, who had lived in the mid-1800s and oversaw every twin birth in the family line. Her handwriting was meticulous, looping elegantly across the pages, but beneath the beauty of the script lurked a darkness so precise and calculated that Harold could not look away. Eleanor chronicled each birth with obsessive detail, but more unsettling were her notes on rituals, offerings, and invocations meant to preserve the twin line. The earliest entries spoke of prayers and charms, small tokens placed under pillows and around cradles, meant to ward off death and ensure the children survived their first days. But as the entries continued, the tone grew increasingly ominous. Eleanor wrote of descending beneath the barn into the damp, root-filled soil, carrying small items, clay figurines, scraps of fabric, and even blood drawn from herself, to perform ceremonies at the graves of prior twins. She described chanting words that were not in any language Harold recognized, invoking names she claimed belonged to entities beneath the earth and older than time. The rituals, she wrote, were designed not only to keep the twin line alive, but to ensure that the essence of the family would endure, no matter the cost. Harold read passages where Eleanor recounted the night she performed the ritual that corresponded with the birth of Elias, the surviving twin. She detailed the coldness in the air, the hum that rose from the soil, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. She spoke of leaving the barn at dawn, trembling yet certain that the twin had been imbued with something beyond human inheritance, a fragment of an older presence that would guide and protect the line for generations. Every word radiated obsession, a devotion to something that blurred the line between life and something else entirely. The diaries also contained warnings, almost as if Eleanor anticipated the day when someone might discover her writings. She wrote that the rituals should never be broken, that interrupting the cycle would bring consequences not just to the Parish family, but to the land itself. The soil beneath the barn, she claimed, remembered every act, every whisper, every sacrifice. And those who disturbed it risked awakening what slumbered there. As Harold turned the final pages, a sense of inevitability settled over him. The twins had never been ordinary children. They had been deliberately shaped, bound to the land and the line through rituals that defied natural order, and the echoes of those ceremonies were still alive, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Harold closed the diaries, a cold sweat coating his forehead, and glanced toward the shadows of the decaying barn. The air felt heavier, charged with expectation, as if the land itself had been holding its breath for over a century, waiting for someone to witness the truth that Eleanor Parish had so meticulously recorded, the truth that refused to die in 2024. The Parish estate had fallen into near-total ruin, yet it still drew Nora Parish back, pulled by the weight of her ancestry and the promises of inheritance. She had never met Elias or any other of the family's cursed line, but the stories had always haunted her childhood. Faint whispers in family gatherings, half-forgotten warnings from elders, and the strange unease that seemed to cling to her whenever she ventured near the hollow. Now, as a grown woman, she returned to the crumbling mansion to finalize the sale of the land, hoping to sever ties to a past that had always felt like a shadow pressing against her. She arrived in late autumn, the air sharp and damp, carrying the faint scent of decayed leaves and something else, deeper, almost metallic. The house loomed ahead, its windows blackened, the roof sagging in the middle, yet it was familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. Nora moved cautiously through the halls, her footsteps stirring dust that had settled for decades. The wind whistled through broken panes, echoing like faint cries, and she could swear she felt eyes watching her from the shadows. Yet she pressed on, determined to examine the property one final time. She explored the nursery, now bare except for broken furniture and the remnants of peeling wallpaper, her gaze falling on the corner where a faint indentation in the floor suggested something had once lain there. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and her skin prickled. As she ran her hand along the wall, she felt the faintest vibration, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards, a rhythm that matched her own in eerie synchrony. Days later, Nora discovered she was pregnant, and with it came a growing unease she could not ignore. The doctors assured her it was normal to feel anxiety, especially when carrying twins, as she learned she was. But the unease persisted, intensifying whenever she was near the estate or even when she closed her eyes to sleep. She began to dream of two small figures in the mist, shadows with eyes too dark and faces too still, standing at the edge of the woods, waiting. At times, the dreams felt like memories, though she could not place them in her own life. She confided in no one, fearing ridicule, yet the presence of the twins in her womb seemed to awaken something in the house, or perhaps something in her bloodline itself. The estate, long silent, began to respond. The floors creaked without reason. Doors that had never moved swung slightly, and faint humming echoed through empty halls. The shadows deepened, clinging to her as she walked, and the air thickened in rooms where she lingered too long. It was as if the house recognized her, as if it had been waiting for a descendant capable of bearing the twins again. And with each passing day, Nora felt the weight of the Parish legacy pressing against her, a quiet insistence that what had begun so many generations ago was far from over, and that the land and its children had chosen her to continue what had been set in motion centuries before. The night of the storm arrived with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. Thunder split the sky, shaking the foundations of the crumbling Parish estate, and rain lashed against the broken windows, drumming a relentless rhythm that filled every empty room. Nora Parish, exhausted and fearful, labored under the flickering light of a single lantern, her hands trembling as the contractions gripped her. The air in the nursery was thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and damp decay, and shadows seemed to stretch and twist along the walls, curling around corners and lingering unnaturally near the corners of her vision. Outside, the wind howled through the hollow, carrying with it the faint echo of infant cries that did not belong to the present but seemed to rise from some distant past. When the first twin emerged, silence fell abruptly. The baby's skin was pale, almost translucent in the lantern light, and the eyes opened immediately, dark and unyielding, reflecting the storm outside in a way that made Nora's chest tighten with dread. There was no wail, no immediate sign of life in the conventional sense. Only a steady, unblinking stare that seemed to pierce through her, into her very thoughts. The midwife assisting Nora whispered under her breath, urging prayers, but her voice shook with fear. The second twin followed soon after, still and fragile, its body oddly stiff in her arms. As she attempted to breathe life into it, a sudden flicker of lightning illuminated the room, and for a moment, it appeared as if the shadows themselves leaned closer, watching, waiting. The house responded in ways Nora could not have anticipated. The lanterns swayed violently, though there was no breeze inside, and the floorboards beneath her groaned as though alive. From somewhere beyond the nursery, the faintest sounds of movement echoed, small, deliberate footsteps pacing through the hallways and along the stairs, though no one else was present. She felt the presence of something ancient, something connected to the twin line, stirring awake within the very walls of the house. The cries of the storm outside became a chorus in harmony with the silent murmurs that emanated from the room itself, as if the air was vibrating with unseen energy. Despite the stillness of the twins, their eyes moved, tracking Nora, the midwife, even the shadows, with uncanny awareness. It was impossible to determine where the children ended and the darkness of the house began. Time stretched and twisted, the storm and the cries merging into a continuous thrum of tension. The air felt charged, electric with anticipation, and for every heartbeat that passed, the nursery seemed to pulse with the weight of generations long dead yet never gone. The birth had concluded, but the house, the land, and the very blood of the Parish line were far from finished, waiting to reveal what had been buried for over a century. The morning after the storm, the Parish estate was eerily calm, as though the night's chaos had never occurred. The heavy clouds had lifted, revealing a pale sun that struggled to pierce the lingering fog, and the broken windows of the house glinted like lifeless eyes. When investigators arrived, called by neighbors alarmed at the persistent cries during the night, they found the estate deserted. The nursery was immaculate in its silence, the floorboards still warm from the recent birth, but there was no sign of the twins. Cradles sat empty, blankets folded unnaturally neat, and the lingering smell of rain and old wood filled the air. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances, the hair on their arms rising as they felt the subtle pull of something unseen. It was then that they noticed the footprints. Small, delicate, yet distinctly human in shape, they began near the nursery, pressed into the dust of the floorboards, and continued toward the back of the house. The tracks were precise, almost purposeful, each step deliberate, as if the children knew exactly where they were going. But when the investigators reached the broken door that led to the overgrown yard, the footprints became muddied, as if the soil itself had absorbed part of their weight, leaving only an impression of two small figures moving toward the edge of the forest. The investigators called out, but their voices were swallowed by the mist and the rustling trees, the echoes returning only as whispers of their own fear. Following the trail, they reached the edge of the woods where the footprints abruptly ended. There was no sign of struggle, no indication the twins had fallen or been taken. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of crows disturbed the silence. The investigators peered into the mist, straining to see, but the forest swallowed any hint of movement. It was as though the children had stepped into the air itself, leaving nothing but the memory of their presence behind. The fog thickened, pressing against their skin, and a cold wind stirred from the depths of the trees, carrying faint, childlike murmurs that made the investigators' blood run cold. For hours, they searched, calling names, shining lanterns, and tracing the faint disturbances in the earth. But the twins had vanished completely. The estate, once a house filled with generations of secrets, returned to its silence, the shadows resuming their slow, deliberate crawl along the walls and floorboards. In the hollow beyond the trees, the air seemed to shimmer slightly, as if two small forms were moving just out of reach, their presence there but inaccessible, bound to the land yet untouchable by the living. The parish line, thought to have ended with forgotten graves and abandoned rituals, had endured, leaving the investigators with a chilling understanding. Some inheritances are not of wealth or blood alone, and some legacies are far older and more insidious than any history book could reveal.